It's Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell.
All right, folks, welcome back. Happy Independence Day, I guess, right? July 2nd. This is when the vote actually took place. They didn't sign the thing till July 4th. Welcome to the program. We have Senator-elect from District 15 in the great state of Arkansas, Senator Mark Johnson. Senator-elect Mark Johnson. Hey, thanks for being on the program, Mark.
Thanks, Paul. It's always a pleasure to be with you on this. I guess we could just celebrate this whole week. We'll just call it Independence Week.
Let's do it. Independence Week. I like it. That's like, that's my wife says that the month of June is her birth month, so she wants to celebrate her birthday all month long. And
yes, we have a saying around and I won't make a big deal out of it. Someone will get back to her, but we refer to the week or two around my wife's birthday as Kathy Fest, so please don't spread that with anyone.
Kathy Fest. Okay. Something tells me that your wife and my wife would get along in their,
I'm sure they would.
Interpretations of birthday.
Oh, it's so interesting. You put that clip of President Reagan. His point is so valid in that, we drew up the Constitution and then soon after the Bill of Rights to more or less, and Patrick Henry gets a lot of credit for this, but others are involved too. But we passed the Constitution, we ratified it in the various states with the promise that there would be a Bill of Rights, because in the Declaration of Independence, we talk about that the just powers of government are those that they have from the consent of the governed. And that is so important for people to remember, and President Reagan's statement that you just played points out that this is the people telling the government what they can do, not the other way around. And that's what sets us apart from, up until that time in history, every other government, even wise governments, were some kind of benevolent dictator, king, or emperor, giving the people rights. In this case, we said, God gave you those rights. We're just going to create this mechanism to secure it. So I'm so thrilled that you played that clip from President Reagan. It really summed things up.
Yeah, and there is. I'm glad that you mentioned, that the rights come from the Creator. That is such a key difference, with America versus other governments, and it fundamentally established America under a form of humility, because we're saying we don't have all the answers, and that's a very strange thing for any government to do, because like you said, there was always some. Well, first of all, America stands in complete contrast to King George, and they were like, this is strange because we're preaching the gospel. You had George Whitefield and the Great Awakening, and you had all these things happening, and they were saying that, look, everybody's going to be judged by God, and your righteousness your only chance is for your righteousness to be found in Christ. And so, if that's what they were preaching, Mark, the colonists start to think, well, then what is this concept of a royal bloodline, and why does King George why is he special if we're all going to be judged by God? Why is this one guy special? And that, I feel like, planted the seed that eventually allowed us to throw off the yoke.
Oh, absolutely. And Americans at that time many of them looked at themselves as free Englishmen. And as Parliament and the King began to treat them like they were something less than that, second-class citizens or subjects, if you will, that was the real beginning of it, because George Washington and Thomas Jefferson considered themselves equal to all of their former kinsmen, on the other side of the moat, and that was sort of the thing. Wait a minute, I'm just as good as the Duke of whatever, and that was the beginning of that, is seeing each other as equal. But I really want to thank you for having me on. It's never like you think it's going to be. It doesn't matter. I've been around, a lot of people that know me know I've been around this stuff all my whole life, but being a senator-elect is very different than just thinking about it, or even, 50, 60 years around the institution. You're now kind of having to actually make those decisions. And Paul, one of the things I promised in my campaign is
I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the Founding Fathers.
They seem to be in full-scale retreat from spending cuts and are talking about raising people's taxes again. And I have only one thing to say to the tax increasers. Go ahead, make my day.
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. Those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell is on now.
Good morning, Arkansas. Thanks so much for being with us. Thank you for listening to the program today. You have found the intersection of conservative ideas and reality, where we are building a liberty machine with your help, of course. If you want to contribute or sound off, you can do so. Call or text 870-275-9799. We are also up and live over at facebook.com/Conduit News. You can sound off in the comment section there. We got a lot of news to get to this morning. Quite a bit of headlines out there concerning what's going on in Arkansas. Let me go over what we're going to cover on the program today. Over at Conduit for Action, we have an update to an article from last year about the Cloward and Piven strategy, orchestrating a crisis so government can solve it. We'll talk about that. We also have petitions. That's right, petitions, people who have gone out, gathered signatures in an attempt to get their issue on the ballot before the voters this November. We have one group that has submitted signatures to the Secretary of State in an effort to get 2 casinos operating here in Arkansas. We'll have news on that. Also, of course, the much-anticipated term limits petition. They needed 85,000 signatures, and they turned in 135,000, and this has got politicians scrambling for, I don't know, I guess reasons to oppose it in a way. We'll have politicians, both Democrat and Republicans, reaction publicly on Twitter. We'll bring you what they're saying, because that's pretty interesting. Also, considering these term limit petitions or casino petitions and getting stuff before the voters, I started looking at some other states. And come to find out, there are other states who are putting the very idea of Medicaid expansion before the voters. That's right. Their states have refused to expand Medicaid, so there are groups that have gathered signatures to put Medicaid expansion on the ballot to get people to vote themselves, government largesse, to get the people vote themselves, basically free stuff. We'll talk a little bit about that. Also, we want to revisit, in the context of term limits, what convicted Senator John Woods, what he actually did to the state of Arkansas, how he increased their pay with a deceptive amendment and increased legislators' pay and increased the amount of time they could stay in office. We want to set the record straight on that. And then we got to look at what's happening with Caterpillar. Caterpillar is once again, doing business with the government with these incentives, and they're promising to add another 250 jobs in Central Arkansas. We'll give you the news on that. And here's probably the biggest news of the day. Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin out with an op-ed in Talk Business and Politics, where he is essentially debunking this concept that making out-of-state sellers pay an internet sales tax, or requiring or using the argument that there's a use tax already owed when you, as an Arkansan, buy something on the internet. He says, essentially, he's saying, look, if you're going to claim that that's not increasing the tax burden or a tax increase, then, basically you're kidding. Now, here's a quote from him. Technicalities aside, at the end of the day, more money will go to the government and less will be left in the pockets of taxpayers. I'll cover that coming up in the program today. But let's start with what I think needs to be the top headline here, and that is what has happened with this medical abortion law and how we have this judge who blocked it, The Supreme Court refused to hear it. The law went into effect, essentially saying if you're going to get an abortion with these abortifacients or abortion-inducing drugs, then you have to contract with a physician so that if something goes wrong, you don't have this woman driving herself to the emergency room, seeing a doctor that knows nothing about what's just happened and what her procedure is, or what they've done to her. And of course, now we have the judge blocking it again. And for more on that, let's go to Family Council over at their website. They have a video that they posted. You have Sharice Dean doing an excellent job in this video, kind of breaking down what the status of Arkansas's abortion or medical abortion law is right now. Go ahead and click play on that, Joe. Let's hear what she has to say.
And I'm standing in front of the federal courthouse where U.S. District Court Judge Christine Baker struck down a really good pro-life law on late Monday afternoon.
The injunction issued blocks Arkansas's 2015 Abortion-Inducing Drug Safety Act.
This is a really good law that requires abortion-inducing drugs to be administered according to the FDA protocol, and says that clinics that perform these abortions must contract with the physician who has hospital admitting privileges to handle complications from the abortions. In May, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear arguments over a 2016 order that Judge Christine Baker issued against the law, allowing it to go into effect. Judge Baker's latest restraining order blocks the law that protects women who choose this type of abortion. So once again, women who experience complications will have to drive themselves to the emergency room and wait to be seen by a doctor who knows nothing about their medical history. This law had overwhelming support in the legislature, was signed into law by Governor Hutchinson, and was championed by Representative Charlene Fight and Senator Linda Collins Smith. This was all done to protect women. Judge Baker's decision does not protect women. It not only blocks the law, but it blocks women from receiving the type of health care that they should receive in an emergency situation. This is why I'm so grateful we have pro-life Attorney General Leslie Rutledge, who has done an excellent job defending this law so far. And I believe she'll have yet another victory after this decision is appealed. I'm Sharice Dean, and this has been Family Time with Family Council.
All right, that's again, you can find out more at familycouncil.org. That's familycouncil.org there. So that's the status of the law right now. It has been blocked. You know, a lot of people are calling Arkansas the most pro-life state in the nation, and I think it's because, and I really I've covered this before, but I think it's because people have been educated and they realize what we're talking about here. We're talking about human life. We're talking about life and death situations here. And I think that's really, when I was growing up, that wasn't the case. When I was growing up in Arkansas, I've lived here all my life, that wasn't necessarily the case. There were people who just kind of bought into this liberal idea, this concept of, what are they calling it now? Reproductive rights. Reproductive rights. And they bought into this idea, or, or it was kind of like just don't say anything. Don't be, a lot of people thought this is what was crazy, especially, as being in the Bible Belt like Arkansas is. They thought that this, talking about this, let's say at church or something, was bringing politics into church. It's, we can't do that. It's like, what are you talking about? I mean, are we, and anyway, slowly, and I think it took a long time to get to this point. People started realizing, you know what? I think they started realizing that the Democrat Party and the money system that goes, all the way up to the top and beyond, all the way up to the federal government and beyond, just like the Republican side does, but you do definitely have a difference in at least a platform when it comes to abortion. And I think a lot of people started realizing that, and it didn't matter necessarily if your Democrat, state representative was also, a friend of yours or a neighbor. That wasn't just an excuse to vote for them if if they're going to toe the line when it comes to this issue. And so slowly but surely people got educated and they started figuring it out. And I'm hoping that the state of Arkansas will do the same thing on tax policy eventually, or the idea or the concept of big government versus small, limited government that functions better, recognizing the pitfalls of big government, the benefits of a limited government. I'm not sure if we're going to get there, but this issue, seeing where Arkansas is on this issue, it certainly gives me hope in that regard. Speaking of this idea of reproductive rights, Kelsey Grammer, you remember Kelsey Grammer? He's an actor, right? Frasier. He got his, that's where his big, I guess he started on Cheers. He was just Frasier on Cheers, and they gave him his own show. He's kind of a conservative, and if you some of these Hollywood types that Hollywood calls conservative, maybe not so much, but he is on the right, very much like the actor James Woods, who recently was, dropped by his agent because of his pro-Trump tweets, because this is where we are at this point, right? You can't even associate with somebody that has differing political views from you, especially not in Hollywood. But anyway, actor Kelsey Grammer, according to Breitbart, Thomas Williams, he was interviewed recently and explained why he was pro-life. He was interviewed by The Times, and he called out the abortion industry as dishonest for using the euphemism reproductive rights. When they're talking about abortion, they use reproductive rights. Now, look at this photo of him. He's got this T-shirt on. He took a lot of heat with this. This was, I guess, an earlier story. He's got a T-shirt on that said, "Would it bother us more if they used guns?" Talking about abortion. Because the left is so anti-gun, and they think guns are these things that float around as sentient beings murdering people because they have free will. That's what the left thinks. So it's like, would they actually care? And it's so funny, if you listen to any of these people, anytime there's a shooting, or the idea that they're standing up for kids who are being separated from their parents at the border because their parents have committed a crime, just like if you were driving down the road and were driving drunk down the road with your kids in the car, you'd go to jail and your kids wouldn't. They would separate you. But they want to care about the kids, but then they don't care about the kids when they're in the mother's womb because they don't have rights under the Constitution according to their concepts and ideas about, when somebody has rights. Again, we've been down this road before. We used to say because, you had a certain skin tone that you didn't have rights under the Constitution. And now we're continuing to draw these arbitrary lines in the sand, but inside the mother's womb. Anyway, listen to what Kelsey Grammer said here. Grammer told The Times he has as much respect for women and women's issues as possible, but said that women's rights are not what's at stake with abortion. It gets a bit dishonest to call something reproductive rights when you clearly have a choice well before a baby is conceived. If someone has to die, listen to this. Now listen to what he said about rape, because they're always like, exceptions for rape. He says, if someone has to die as a result of rape, then we should kill the rapist, not the unborn child, he said. It's a dicey area, but if you have respect for life and respect for choice, then you can't take life away from an infant. And then he goes on to say, little makes me angry, but injustice does. The question that we need to ask ourselves as a country, and I say this because Donald Trump is about to announce his pick for the next Supreme Court justice. And this particular Supreme Court justice could tilt the balance of power on the court to the point where Roe versus Wade, in this concept, a perverted one, that a child does not have rights in the womb, but when it's out the womb, it does. But if it's in, no rights. If it's out, rights under the Constitution. This perverted concept, it might very well be on its way out, depending on who he picks, assuming that you can get through the confirmation process or whatever. The question I think we've got to ask ourselves as a country is, since 1974, you have 54 plus maybe 60 million abortions in this country. You have more in terms of loss of productivity in our society as far as population. You have more than that because since 1974 you would have had babies that the babies would have had. Is that an injustice? Is that massive loss of life? Do we consider that an injustice today? I do. I think Kelsey Grammer does. I think the Supreme Court pick is a huge deal. Donald Trump is expected to announce it, I guess, tonight. He said he's going to have his mind made up by noon today. So we're all waiting on that. That is the news. Folks, we're going to take a break. We're going to be right back in just a moment, going to explore the Cloward and Piven strategy. Follow-up article by Mr. Josh Waters. It's up right now at conduitforaction.org. That's conduitforaction.org. We'll be back in just a moment.
Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell is building a liberty machine. Find out more at conduitnews.com.
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for being with us today. I see Gene on Facebook writing that politicians cannot allow term limits to be reinstated. We'll talk a little bit about that. We'll have some politicians' reactions to the fact that the Restore Term Limits effort, they needed 85,000 signatures. They submitted 135,000. You have to assume some of those are going to get thrown out. You have to also assume that if this thing actually gets approved and gets put on the ballot, for us to limit legislators to 10 years of service, which is perfectly reasonable in my opinion, that they're going to fight this tooth and nail, and you would assume there's going to be a lawsuit to protect the status quo and protect the legislators' power. I would predict that, and I would predict that the lawsuit is going to come maybe in late September. And the reason they'll do that is because they'll create a crisis. They'll demand that people consider their arguments quickly so they can get it thrown off the ballot in time for the November. It'll be a whole contrived controversy. Mark my words, there's probably going to be a lawsuit on this because they cannot afford, just like Gene said, they cannot afford to reinstate term limits. But I'm going to have more on that and the whole petition gathering process here in just a moment. Mr. Josh Waters headlined The Cloward-Piven Strategy, Orchestrating a Crisis So Government Can Solve It. If you got a problem, I'll solve it. Last fall, Conduit for Action published an article titled, Are You the Victim of Rules for Radicals? To highlight the political tactics to those seeking to diminish liberty. At the end of the article, there was a tease for a future breakdown of the Cloward-Piven strategy. This is that article. By the way, if you've never read Rules for Radicals, you probably need to read it. It is a Saul Alinsky piece, and it's extremely, I don't know, it's just scary to think that somebody would go into that much detail on how to disrupt, I would just say disrupt Western civilization, but essentially it's to disrupt a limited government that protects individual freedoms and gives you liberty by securing the rights of our Creator. It's a book written specifically to undermine that, because at the beginning, Saul Alinsky dedicates the book to Satan. And you should go, I'm just saying those are the forces we're dealing with here. It's not a gray area. It's very black and white when you understand the theological persuasions of some who are on the left. The end goal of the Cloward-Piven strategy is the creation of a political crisis leading to a guaranteed annual income. Essentially, the Cloward-Piven strategy would lead to a complete control of citizens through socialism, communism, Josh Waters writes. As a background, you have Francis Fox Piven, a professor of political science and sociology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. The late Richard Cloward was a sociologist and liberal activist and Piven's spouse. Their strategy to implement political crisis to achieve a guaranteed annual income was published in the May 2nd, 1966 edition of The Nation, a leading liberal political and cultural magazine. In this publication, their main goal to achieve the crisis was to have a massive drive to recruit the poor onto the welfare rolls. A federal program to administer these large welfare programs would be needed. Stop. Does anybody want to, editorialize that last statement and compare it to where we are today here in this country and maybe the things that Arkansas has advocated for? I mean, we've asked for a long time, why are Republican politicians bending over backwards to keep a socialized health care program from a socialist president in Barack Obama? Why are they doing this? Do they not know the stated goals on the far left and how they get to where they want to go, how they tear down what they thought was bad and institute what they think is good, and getting people dependent on the government and not themselves is the first way to do it? A federal program to administer these large welfare programs would be needed. This is because if it is administered locally, there would be lower enrollment because, quote, the poor are most visible and proximate in the local community. Antagonism toward them has always, therefore, been more intense locally than at the federal level. This means that if there was more oversight at the local level, it would not allow the welfare rolls to increase to the levels needed to cause a financial crisis. Therefore, their solution was to move programs to D.C., where people are not as aware of the costs and oversight of the programs. The strategy also rejected that a person could overcome poverty through any institution of private enterprise, signaling that hard work, education, and personal responsibility are not a solution to poverty. Their only solution is a federal program of income redistribution to elevate the poor en masse from poverty. Back in a moment.
We work on ethics, and I've been working on it. I'm actually working on a draft of a bill. I've talked to some other legislators about it, specifically some House members as well. And I'm working on this thing, and I don't want to take anything away from the work that the new Senate Ethics Committee is doing, because they're kind of doing an inside thing. It's an inside baseball. These are senators policing themselves, but what I'm working on will be a statute that will prescribe some behaviors and set some criminal penalties for those that violate the public trust. And you know, we do need to have the Senate have rules that and procedures that people have to disclose their conflicts of interest. And I would take it maybe a step further than the rule that was recently passed that more or less says you have to shine the light on yourself. I would say that we need to take it a step further, and that in certain cases, and then this is where it gets difficult, which cases, but that a senator would have to recuse from participating in certain legislation, including voting on certain legislation. And whatever I come up with, and my other colleagues that are working with, whatever we come up with, it'll have to meet that test.
That's actually a really good point, Mark. Sometimes they are incompatible. So are we willing to, how many legislators down there now, or people, you know, who are involved in the process, are willing to accept that as a potential outcome? Because if we are willing to accept that as a potential outcome, meaning there's some legislators, you know, who are attorneys, that it's just not going to be compatible for you anymore, or you're going to have to alter the type of clients that you take. I feel like that's perfectly reasonable. You know, if it means that we as a people have more confidence in our government, that they're not enriching themselves, you know, through this illicit manner or having this conflict of interest. But I'm kind of also skeptical at the same time. You know, if that outcome where it's possible that it's just not compatible, if they reject that as being a possible outcome from these laws, I don't know if the problem, you know, is going to be properly addressed. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's no magic bullet for this thing. I wish there were, but we do bump into the problem of again, this citizen legislature thing. I mean, you're not going to get successful people, then that's smart people, the people that we want to serve, to quit everything else they're doing and take a $40,000 a year job and do this full time. Now, the people could decide, look, you can't have any outside income.
Bringing you your daily dose of truth. It's Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell.
Josh Waters over at Conduit for Action, talking about the Cloward and Piven strategy. The strategy also rejected that a person could overcome poverty through any institution of private enterprise, signaling that hard work, education, and personal responsibility are not a solution to poverty. Their only solution is a federal program of income redistribution to elevate the poor en masse from poverty. The solution of a guaranteed income to end poverty also must be free from any sort of conditions like work requirements. They say conditional benefits result in violations of civil liberties throughout the nation and in a pervasive oppression of the poor. So according to them, not only are people entitled to other people's money, there can be no conditions on that. Under this logic, they are entitled to the coercive taking of others' money because they exist. Cloward and Piven also stress the importance of marketing these benefits to the masses. The Cloward-Piven strategy also stresses that any removal of benefits should require stringent legal review. The benefits should require administrative hearings with additional court hearings to place barriers to the removal of benefits once received. They hypothesize that lawyers could be recruited on a voluntary basis, especially under the banner of a movement to end poverty by a strategy of asserting legal rights. Enter the ACLU. Waters writes, the liberal strategy calls for a climate of militancy that would overcome attitudes of being on welfare. They state that as the crisis develops, meaning, okay, just so we're clear, the crisis is a financial one because they are basically, it's this non-discretionary spending on welfare or entitlement programs, and eventually you run out of money, and then the government comes down in the middle of the crisis, and essentially, you have government from, a dictator from a single source, really. I mean, that's the only way. You got to have a strong man to do something like this. And on their little chalkboard, they say, well, once we get the utopia we want and we perfect man somehow, with just our ideas, or we're just going to try really, really hard to perfect man, then the strong man's going to give power up and it'll be great. It's like, hello? I mean, were you alive during the 20th century, or did you read anything about what happened in the 20th century? It wasn't just one. We had you had several experiments with this in different countries, in different parts of the globe, and it ends in mass death for those who are the least politically connected. So, but the crisis, let's get back to the crisis, a financial one. They state that as the crisis develops, it will be important to use the mass media to inform the broader liberal community about the inefficiencies and injustices of welfare. The liberal infestation of mainstream media has occurred. Their ideal political movement would be cadres of aggressive organizers from the civil rights movement and the churches, from militant low-income organizers like those formed by Saul Alinsky and other groups on the left. Their plan was also ahead of the curve on implementing generational welfare dependency because they highlight that once eligibility for basic food and rent grants is established, I guess the drain on local resources persists indefinitely. Their target demographic was a coalition between poor whites and poor blacks. Their ultimate aim of this strategy is a new program for direct income distribution, also known throughout history as socialism/communism, which has led to the death, despair, and depravity of hundreds of millions. The 4 steps of the Cloward-Piven strategy: number 1, overload and break the welfare system. Number 2, have chaos ensue. Number 3, take control in the chaos. Number 4, implement socialism, communism through government force. Josh Waters writes, as Milton Friedman famously said, there is nothing so permanent as a temporary government program. This is because government sets out to fix a problem with a new program. However, that program never seems to go away. Does this mean government never fixes a problem, or that government will never shrink unless forced to do so by receiving less money? Yeah, government will not shrink unless we give it less money, and you got to have politicians in there willing to set up that type of policy, that type of tax code. I love that, though. There's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program. Not to mention, a lot of the programs, or a lot of the expansion of government comes after the government caused the problem in the first place. They pass some law, they get unintended consequences, or maybe in some cases, if you're Cloward and Piven and basically aspiring evil super geniuses, trying to, what I'm saying? Like actively in their strategy, they are saying we're deceiving everybody by giving them something that is good, but we really have a completely different arm, and we really want to, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's very, very evil what they're doing here. This article is up right now at conduitforaction.org. It's really been making the rounds on Facebook over the weekend. A lot of comments, really, really interesting. A lot of people, though, not a lot of people, but there's some, trolls out there who are really upset about, articles that point out that this is about, this is a strategy that I think has been implemented. And if you look at the fact, let's just think about this for a second. Let's just think about it for a second. If we take the fact that we instituted Medicaid expansion here in this state, and it has been a disaster, and everything they said it was going to do from a conservative standpoint was wrong, okay? Well, are we really going to suggest that this Arkansas Works, where they're trying to do these work requirements that aren't really requirements because there's so many exemptions for them and everything else, are we really going to say that this program is not going to have its pitfalls as well, that it's going to need another program to fix it? I mean, Arkansas Works at its very basic form was an attempt to rename a program that the voters had figured out was big government. At the very least, that's all Arkansas Works was. Asa renamed it because we had all figured out private option was Obamacare, and we don't like Obamacare because we don't like socialism, right? So he renames it. At the very least, are we really? So you have one program, and it's essentially the same thing, but it's technically different, I guess. Are we really going to say that that's going to fix the? No. And is there going to, if we keep going with this madness? Oh, well, we need another program to fix it, and then we need another program to fix it. I mean, we can see that right now. Later on in the program, we're going to cover the fact that Caterpillar is supposedly, according to the headlines, they're going to create 250 more jobs in Central Arkansas. Okay, all right, sounds good. Well, what about the last time they made these commitments? Well, they didn't live up to their expectations. If you read into the meat of the article, they didn't live up to their expectations. They had to pay some of the money back, but lo and behold, according to the new agreement, they're not going to have to pay the rest of the money back to the state that they owe after getting all of these tax incentives. I mean, it's just like government is just not going to hold themselves accountable. Government and their friends not going to hold themselves accountable unless you have a situation where preferred family health care, where it's so blatantly obvious because the people at the top are all going to jail. Then it's obvious. And then we have to end the contracts with preferred family health care because there's so much fraud and abuse and bribery that's going on, and the public's been made aware of it. But when it's little things like, the government can't actually create jobs like they claim to do. Really, the only thing that is there substantively when these announcements come are the announcements themselves that give political clout and political capital to the people that claim, who are in office, that they have made some great deal with some private company, and now the government's going to give them all these tax incentives or give them lump sums of cash. I mean, the biggest winner, anytime you have this corporate welfare announcement, the biggest winners are not the workers, it's the politicians. And it's the politicians that get the press to write the positive headlines for them, saying that they are the job creators. When Ronald Reagan left in 1989, he didn't say he created 20 million jobs in 8 years. He said the American people created 20 million jobs. And that's because Ronald Reagan tried to get government out of the way. The only thing Ronald Reagan really failed at, from what I can see, is he spent too much money. He didn't get the spending under control. All right, the phone number, 870-275-9799. Let's move on now to the petitions that have been going out. They've been going around. I'm sure you've been asked to sign a petition here or there. One of them has to do with casinos. Talk Business and Politics staff has this write-up over at talkbusiness.net. Headline, Casino Group submits signatures to Secretary of State's office. Now, so what they want to do is essentially they want to have the people vote on whether or not we put two casinos in the state of Arkansas. That's the way I understand this. Now, they need 84,859 valid signatures, and the group that, again, wants two casino operations in the state with part of the revenue helping to fund highways. They submitted 96,170 signatures to the Secretary of State. So there could, there's going to be some that are going to get thrown out, but, we'll see what happens. Last time they attempted to do this, I think there was a lawsuit and it got, they were unsuccessful. By the way, I do have to remind you, one of the stories we covered last week had to do with the fact that last fiscal year, the state of Arkansas took a record amount of revenue from you and me, meaning they took an all-time high of money from you and me, and yet they still are talking about tax increases on gas and tax increases on fuel to pay for highways. Now, when we're already giving the government a ton of money to do things, and they come back to us and say, well, we need more, well, we need to be asking, well, what are you doing with the money that we're actually giving you? I mean, the fact that they have record revenue, and this is the whiteboard from last week. Last week was a weird week because of the Independence Day celebration in the middle of it. Record revenue, but still no highways. and I have to make this point again, you have the Arkansas State Police warning drivers here in the state of Arkansas to not drive and camp out in the left lane. That the left lane is only for passing traffic, and it's the law. You need to, and of course now, don't stay in the right lane if there's an emergency vehicle. Then you do need to move over, right? Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is, on a lot of Arkansas highways and interstates, if you drive in the right lane, you're going to tear your tires up faster. You're going to tear your suspension up faster. They're taking record amounts of revenue from us, and we still don't have highways. Not the kind, I mean, look, anybody ever been to other states around us? It's kind of embarrassing, especially when you get to that state line and it's ba-bump, 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 and then smooth in the next state over. So anyway, the casino situation, let me know what you think on this. I mean, the last time this casino effort, they were trying to write specific business interests into the Constitution, meaning the constitutional amendment on casinos last time that didn't get enough traction. It would have actually written in business interests into the text of our Arkansas Constitution, like the names of the companies. I mean, you can't get much worse than that, right? I mean, the states everywhere, they are more than happy, it seems like, to provide their citizens with a way to gamble away their money. And, look, we've interviewed Mr. David Colbert on the program before, and he's very much aware of the disaster that is the state lottery. But what is it, the state lottery? They always have a hook, right? Well, it's for the kids. It's for the scholarship lottery. If you don't support government-sanctioned gambling, then you don't support the children. If you don't support this casino amendment, then you must not support good roads. They could probably even twist it a little further. If you don't support this casino amendment, then you must be for more people dying on the road because of collapsing bridges and chug holes. Chug holes is not my word. That's Dan Douglas. I've never heard it called a chug hole until State Representative Dan Douglas called it chug holes. Anyway, we'll see what happens. I have one quote here. A spokesman for Driving Arkansas Forward, quote, "This proposed constitutional amendment will provide new tourism opportunities in every region of Arkansas, create additional jobs where we need them the most, and generate new tax money that can be used to improve roads and lower our taxes." Boy, that is quite the statement. You can frame anything as positive as long as you put jobs in there. But now tourism is a new thing. We need people to come to Arkansas so that they can gamble. I'm pretty sure if you want to be a tourist and gamble, you'd much rather go to Las Vegas than Arkansas. Tourism. Anyway, we also have, and this is big news, speaking of petitions and getting on the ballot, we have 135,000 signatures submitted to limit the terms of Arkansas legislators. This is a huge story. Michael Wickline, the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, the sponsors of a proposed constitutional amendment that would limit state lawmakers to serving 10 years, said Friday that they have collected more than 135,000 signatures of registered voters in their attempt to qualify the measure for the November 6th general election ballot. Thomas Steele of Little Rock, chairman of the Arkansas Term Limits Committee, signed an affidavit stating that the committee turned in 135,590 signatures on parts of 19,714 petitions to the Secretary of State's office. To qualify for the ballot, sponsors of constitutional amendments are required to collect 84,859 signatures of registered voters. I mean, so they really, really overshot. I mean, they've got a lot of signatures. You got to assume that they're going to throw some out, but that's a big chunk of that's a big number. 135,000. You only need 84,000. Okay, so it says Steele stopped short of predicting that the Secretary of State's office will verify that his group collected enough signatures without needing another 30 days to gather more. Quote, "We think we've gotten enough to get across the finish line. We feel if we get there that Arkansas voters are going to probably repeat what they've done in the past. They want term limits," Steele told supporters after hugging a few supporters and holding back tears of joy. Now, why would he have tears of joy? That's because convicted Senator John Woods lied to the entire state of Arkansas with his amendment that purported to say it was an ethics amendment, and at the same time was claiming to set term limits. And it made a lot of people think that we didn't have term limits. We already had term limits. He was resetting them. He was making it longer, and many people voted for it. And they failed, to understand the deception, and it was a clear deception. And I think we need to reestablish term limits back closer to what they were in order to throw off this yoke of Senator John Woods and how it's affected this entire state. Let's get rid of the corruption, and let's start with correcting the deception that was put on the people of Arkansas back in 2014. So, 10 years is plenty long enough, in my opinion. Now, you see we have a few more articles here. Here's Andrew DeMillo of the Associated Press. Supporters of Arkansas term limits turn in 135,000 signatures, but politicians don't like this, folks. Politicians and some attorneys don't like this at all. Take a look at this. Go to this tweet, Joe. So Charlie Collins, State Representative Charlie Collins, a Republican, and Democrat Greg Leding, both of Fayetteville, are big. They're in agreements. I mean, they don't like these term limits. They don't like the idea of limiting how long they can stay in office. Greg Leding, Democrat Greg Leding says term limits aren't what enabled Republicans to win more seats. Number 2, the total length of time a person could serve didn't change in 2014. What? That's not true. Number 3, an independent body sets the salaries. An independent body, Greg Leding, they're appointed by you guys. An independent body sets the salaries appointed by legislators. You act like, come on, don't treat us like we're idiots, Greg. Come on now. That's ridiculous. Now, Charlie Collins responds to that tweet by saying, quote, I love it when I can agree with my fellow Fayetteville, Arkansas legislature, Representative Greg Leding, well said. So we have Republicans and Democrats both coming out against the term limits ballot. Politicians are kind of freaking out because they don't want to limit their service to 10 years. They like it better where it is. Mark on Twitter responds that says, undetected graft makes it necessary, though. If we lose some good people, that's part of the price to be paid for not policing yourselves. Now, that is a great statement by Mark there on Twitter. But we have attorney David Couch, who was responsible, who wrote the Issue 3 along with John Woods. He says that's like saying it's okay to jail innocent people because there might be a criminal somewhere. You know what, David, in the context of government, you're exactly right. It's that healthy American skepticism. That's why we have enumerated powers into the Constitution, and we don't give the federal government authority to do everything anytime it has an idea. Does that make sense to you? So what you're essentially saying here, yeah, David, I would agree with you to a lesser extent. The idea that you have to count on people to do the wrong thing because we're humans and we're fallen and we prove time and time again that we're going to try to use power to hurt someone else. We're going to try to use government to hurt someone else. It used to be standing armies. Now we just do it with a pen, right? C.S. Lewis talked about the well-lit rooms. And where liberty dies, and now it's signed and minuted and approved by voice vote and all of this stuff, and it's a covert way to take freedom away from people. I'm going to look up the actual quote. We got to take a break though. Back in just a moment.
Buy, sell, and trade at Triple R Pawn in Ash Flat. Firearms, computers, sporting goods, musical instruments, tools, jewelry, and everything else you can think of. It's all at Triple R Pawn at the Light in Ash Flat. Gun enthusiasts, log on now to TripleRPawn.com and browse their amazing inventory. That's rrpawn.com. You can also call them at 870-994-PAWN. That's 870-994-7296. Let the great team at R Pawn help you find what you're looking for. That's R Pawn at the light in Ash Flat, rrpawn.com, or call 870-994-PAWN.
Russellville-based firearms manufacturer Omega are making clones of the most notable German firearms in the world. These delayed rotor-lock firearms have been and are currently used by law enforcement and military worldwide. At Omega, they manufacture their guns right here in Arkansas and produce the best reproduction in the marketplace that comes with a complete 5-year warranty. At Omega, they take firearm manufacturing seriously and offer discounts to active and retired law enforcement. Whether you're using Omega firearms to defend the public, defend your family, or for target practice, Omega has your back. For pricing, go to omega-guns.com. That's omega-guns.com.
Determined to drain the swamp in Little Rock, it's Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell.
Yes, the very concept of a limited government, the very reason that you attempt to limit government and what it can do to other people is because you are assuming that they are capable of the worst. You are assuming that they are capable of vast criminal behavior. I've got that quote that I couldn't remember. C.S. Lewis said, "The greatest evil is not now done in those sordid dens of crime that Dickens loved to paint. It is not done even in concentration camps and labor camps. In those, we see its final result. But it is conceived and ordered, moved, seconded, carried, and minuted in clean carpeted, warmed, and well-lighted offices by quiet men with white collars and cut fingernails and smooth-shaven cheeks who do not need to raise their voices." That, ladies and gentlemen, is pretty frightening when you think about that. That the greatest evil is not done, it's done behind closed doors. And surprise, surprise, are we surprised that Democrats and Republicans in Arkansas agree on term limits and how they don't need to be limited? If the governor gets 8 years, why is it a bad thing for the legislators to get 10 years? Well, you don't understand, Paul. It's the bureaucrats. They're the bureaucrats. We've got to figure out how to handle the bureaucrats. Listen to me. If we're sending, I refuse. I've been down there. I know what's going on. I refuse to believe that if we're truly sending the best and the brightest, and we have people with a mentality that is not one where we just want to not rock the boat, you got to go down there and you got to be willing to rock the boat. And there are different ways to do it. But yeah, I don't know, maybe we should start by saying that if a bureaucrat comes before a committee and lies, that there can be criminal penalties pursued. It should be a crime for bureaucrats. Maybe we don't allow bureaucrats to lobby for any more money. The biggest lobbying arm down there isn't special interests from this business or that business, although they're very powerful. The biggest lobbying arm at the Marble Palace in Little Rock is government agencies themselves. And it's obvious that they're the ones that are, the biggest lobbying. Well, let's try to fix that. But don't use it. So, well, I have to be down there 20 years in order to fix it. I have to be down there 20 years in order to fix it. No, come on. Maybe we need a little urgency instead of this slow process.
The news news and talk of Northeast Arkansas. This is News Talk 101.3 FM and 12:30 AM KBTM, Jonesboro, an EAB radio station.
And this is the only job you can have, and we're going to pay you, picking up $150,000 a year, about what Congress makes, and that's it. You can't get any other income. Well, if we want to do that, that's fine. We've done away with that citizen legislator. We don't have a Senator Gary Stubblefield who is on the farm during the day, and we don't have a Senator Larry Teague who's in the insurance business and understands the day-to-day problems of that. You know, we don't have that. Now that's bad. I think we need that input, but we've got to reconcile those problems. And one thing I want to point out about the things we've seen, the scandals we've seen lately, and I'll mention Senator Files and even Senator A, if we want to do that. These people didn't come to the legislature with these clients, this type of business, and those problems. These are people, and I knowing these people, and I'll add Senator Woods to the mix, these are people that came to the legislature with good intentions, and for most part, early in their career, were good, conscientious, conservative legislators. And somewhere along the way, they were tempted and succumbed. And I say that. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't people that are elected to the legislature that first day they sit there, they're a crook.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Mike and Neal, it didn't take Mike and Neal very long, and he was compromised pretty much immediately.
Well, I tell people, and some people will shock when I say this, I say, you know, Nick Wilson came to the Senate as a reformer, and a little bit too liberal reformer in my view, but that's not, you know, never had a crossword with Senator Wilson. But Nick was part of the reform group that were trying to take down some of the old ways of doing things, where a senator was not just openly on a particular side. He was actually the lobbyist, paid lobbyist for a particular interest group. Mm-hmm. And it was perfectly legal at the time. And we look back at things like that almost in shock, but it was just accepted at that time. So, and in fairness, you know, Nick came to one of his movements were to try to break that up. Well, he succumbed to the dark side, and people are tempted, and there's, you know, you add the kind of money that's flowing through the Medicaid program to the mix, and you've got unscrupulous people like Mr. Cranford, and you know, you get the result that we've seen, and it's not a good thing, and it causes the people to need to be much more conscientious.
I agree with you, and I think what we have to do, and this is what I hope, you know, getting your message out, Mark, and what you're working on, somehow we have to penetrate that Marble Palace bubble and get people to realize the severity of what has taken place and how bad it really is. I mean, some of this has been reactionary because the mainstream media is finally getting involved here and asking tough questions, and, you know, good. But when you go down the list like you just did, Files, Woods, Rusty Cranford, everything else, we've got. I just don't want the exception to make the rules, because, you know, if we're coming down on them, we're putting these new laws in place. The exception doesn't need to make the rule necessarily. And I think if we approach it from that mentality, I think it's going to be very effective. At least I hope it is. I got good hopes for it. I'll give you the last word, sir.
Well, one thing I don't want us to do, Paul, and you're absolutely right in what you just said, but I don't want us to reach a point where, whether it's having to, as was brought out by Senator Rayford, put your elderly mother-in-law's home address on your disclosure form, and things that just reach out beyond just really disclosure, and that's something that's got to be resolved. Things like this that would discourage good people from running for office because they're just not willing to completely open their lives up to scrutiny. There's got to be some middle ground, and the question is, where do we set that bar that protects the integrity of the process but doesn't run off good people? And let's be honest, as one of my soon-to-be colleagues said to me last week, he said, this is a great set of rules we're writing for honest people. And the crooks are going to always have their pie boxes stuffed with cash.
Yeah, that's true.
Immoral
people will always find a way to break the law. That is
Exactly.
a truth we do need to recognize in all this as well. Okay, Senator Mark.
I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the Founding Fathers.
They seem to be in full-scale retreat from spending cuts and are talking about raising people's taxes again. And I have only one thing to say to the tax increasers. Go ahead, make my day.
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. Those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell is on now.
Yes, the petitions are in. You have, we talked about this last hour. If you missed the last hour, feel free to go get the podcast. Go to conduitnews.com or facebook.com/conduitnews. You can watch us do the program. When you get to your desk, you can watch that first part. We talked about pro-life issues, the status of our abortifacient law, what's going on with that, as well as the Cloward-Piven strategy, as well as term limits in the casinos. Now, on that, because you see, people have gone out, they've signed the petitions, and now we're going to have to wait to see if the petitions get verified and as to whether or not we actually get get an amendment on the ballot this November for casinos and for term limits. We will wait and see what happens. I think if you've turned in, for example, the term limits group has turned in 135,000 signatures. They only need 85,000 verified. I think it's a good chance it's going to get on the ballot. I think once that happens, politicians are going to melt down even more than they already have. We have Democrat Charlie Collins we have Republican Charlie Collins and Democrat Greg Leding both agreeing that the term limits legislation is bad. In many cases now, we have the Democrats disagreeing with liberal progressive Max Brantley of the Arkansas Times, which I find odd. It's just interesting that Max Brantley of the Arkansas Times, I think he's recognizing that the corruption is because they're staying in office too long and figuring out ways to enrich themselves. I mean, I really do believe that that's what's going on. I'll reference this article real quick back to this article back on June 19th of 2014 from Conduit for Action. Headline, 16-year term limits proposal actually gives senators 18 to 22 years. Go to the next Conduit for Action article. June 20th of this year, restoring term limits. It's talking about how this was all done by John Woods and how this was a very deceptive way. Up to 22 years in office is not term limits, it's a career. Think about that for a second. In reality, if you work the system right, under John Woods' rule that went to 16 years, it really was 22 years if you work the system right. 22 years in office is not term limits. Folks, that is a career. That is a career, not to mention they raised their salaries. And you've got Democrat Greg Leding saying, no, it's an independent commission. It's an independent commission, and they decide whether or not we get raises. Who appoints, who puts these people on? You do. That's right, you do. The legislative branch puts the people on the committee. Something tells me that they're not going to put anybody out on the committee that doesn't want you to get a raise. My goodness, this is ridiculous. All right, so just go look at those articles if you want more information for people. I mean, on social media, folks, it's going to get crazy. And look, I'm sorry, this may not be as an esoteric or intellectual argument as you want it to be. I mean, we can go there. Clearly, the facts are on our side, folks. Clearly, the facts are on our side. But I would encourage you out there, if a politician himself is actively and openly, saying they don't need these term limits, we shouldn't be surprised. Now, there are people who are not politicians that are against that are against term limits, and I understand your arguments. You say that you're going to throw out the good with the bad. At this point, there are way more bad than good. I mean, whether you're active in it or whether you're just neutral and you don't say anything, then you're complicit in it. Arkansas corruption is in the headlines every single day, right? And we find out more and more and more about them taking bribes. You had one lobbyist that tried to have a guy killed up in New Jersey. Nobody talks about this, but this is all in the headlines, if you know where to look. So, I think term limits are a reasonable approach. What do you think? I mean, folks, the fact that the Marble Palace doesn't want it means that you should be for it. The fact that everybody, the way I feel, and if you got Democrats that are unhappy about it, if you got Republicans that are unhappy about it, how's that not a win for you and me? Somebody tell me where I'm wrong here. I think most of us would think, oh, you mean Democrats are furious about the idea of term limits? Republicans are furious about the idea of term limits? Sounds like a great idea. That must be right where we need to be. That's the kind of compromise I can get behind. Most of the time, the compromise that they're talking about is, we agree that government's going to grow and it's going to spend more money, and we're just going to compromise on how much it's going to grow. That's their What my compromise is, let's just say, hey, both sides are unhappy, wildly so. Wild. I'm in that word specifically. This is going to get wild, folks. This is going to get wild. So, the petitions for the term limits are in. We'll see what happens. Now, speaking of petitions, this is a petition to shrink the size of government. To shrink, how influential some of these politicians can become. There are other people across the country that have put out petitions to grow the size of government. National Public Radio, they've got a headline. Nebraska may join Utah and Idaho in putting Medicaid expansion before voters. Joe, go ahead and throw this one up. Voters in Nebraska may get to decide whether their state expands Medicaid this November. Supporters of Nebraska's Medicaid expansion campaign, listen to this, Ensure the Good Life. What? A welfare program called Ensure the Good Life? Are you kidding me? That's the very definition of, it's no longer a safety net, it's a hammock. It's pretty much a hammock with a glass of iced tea or margarita, whichever your preference. Supporters of Nebraska's Medicaid expansion campaign, Ensure the Good Life, turned in petitions bearing more than 133,000 signatures. And in Nebraska, they need about 85,000 to get it on the ballot. I thought that was so interesting that this is what we're looking at. Of course, Maine, they're building on what happened with Maine. The governor in Maine, Paul LePage, he is anti-Medicaid expansion, but last year, Maine residents bypassed the legislature and voted to expand Medicaid, although that expansion has been held up by a funding dispute with the governor, Paul LePage, because he doesn't think welfare in this regard for able-to-work adults. We're not talking about the truly needy. I had somebody text me that last week, hey, I need to be a little bit more clear that we're not talking about the truly needy when we're talking about Medicaid expansion. You're talking about young, able-to-work adults with no dependents, who many of them are not working. So that's something. But that got me to looking at even more national stories concerning Medicaid expansion. Folks, listen to this headline over at The Advocate, because, see, our state to the south of us, Louisiana, after Bobby Jindal got out of the governor's office, the Democrat got elected kind of on a fluke, and then he immediately expanded Medicaid by fiat. 2 years into Louisiana's Medicaid expansion, thousands on program, but questions persist. This is by Elizabeth Crisp, and listen to this. In 2 years since Louisiana expanded its Medicaid health care program, more than 400 women enrolled have been diagnosed with breast cancer and are receiving treatment. Now, this article goes on to talk about all the successes because, of course, from a government standpoint, folks, if you have a government program, the people most of the time administering that program, they look at the success of it based on the fact that they were able to give away a product for free. Okay? That's what they do. They don't ever talk about the fiscal cost or anything else. But if you scroll down in the middle of this article, you eventually get somebody with some common sense. Okay? You have Representative Tony Bacala, who is a Republican who serves on the House Appropriations Committee down in Louisiana. And this is what he says, quote, "Unless the economy vastly improves, we have to come back and say we're going to raise your taxes again because of health care costs." Now, stop. I only point this out because here in Arkansas, there is a quest for revenue. They don't want to talk about it, but there is a quest for revenue because Arkansas is having to pay for parts of this Medicaid expansion. And that is why they tried to raise your taxes. That's why they tried to raise your internet taxes. That's why they tried to raise your gas taxes. That's why they raised your taxes on tires. They did this because we are in a revenue crisis. And we don't have a spending problem, they say. We have a revenue problem, right? And Louisiana is experiencing the same thing. It's just a little bit more transparent in the media news articles that you can find, right? We have a Republican saying that because of the health care costs and the government responsibility for this welfare program, that the state of Louisiana is going to have to raise taxes because of the welfare program, okay? We're going to have higher state costs very quickly. Bacala stressed to Louisiana Department of Health officials that even a fraction of the health care budget could drastically impact the state's bottom line. On the last day of the third special session this year, Senator Sharon Hewitt, a Slidell Republican in Louisiana, who's considering running against the governor there, Governor Edwards, in next fall's gubernatorial election, specifically called out Medicaid expansion as a source of the state's fiscal woes. Quote, "The governor's decision to expand Medicaid without any consideration of the cost of doing so has grown the cost of health care in Louisiana at the expense of other important priorities. Medicaid is the single biggest expenditure in state government. If we don't rein in the cost of health care in Louisiana, Louisiana will be in a constant fiscal crisis." A constant fiscal crisis. Again, for some reason in Arkansas, we have a mainstream media in the statewide apparatus that somehow protects and promotes Republican establishment politicians because they are continuing these big government aims that pick winners and losers and generate taxpayer revenue streams to private businesses. And I'm telling you right now, if we are in a fiscal crisis or a budget crisis, we're not going to know because they're going to find some creative way to get more money from us while calling it a tax cut. That is my fear, that they're going to try to get more money from us here in Arkansas, but they're going to figure out a way to call it a tax cut. And this is a healthy American skepticism, and we should certainly be very weary of this because I'm telling you, we keep spending and spending and spending. That money has got to come from somewhere. They got record revenue from us last fiscal year, and we still don't have good highways, and we still don't have money for highways. Okay, so that is number one. Now, where is some of our money going? So other parts of our money, folks, are going to other private companies, not even related to the healthcare industry. Last week, we had this headline here from Stephen Steed. Caterpillar to add 250 North Little Rock workers and invest $40 million in a plant. They said this last Thursday that it would expand its Little Rock operations. And it would give an investment of $40 million by 2020. So by 2020, Caterpillar, if we're to believe them, is going to be hiring 250 people, and they're going to put an investment of $40 million into the factory, into the plant, by 2020. So sometime in the next 2 years, this is going to materialize. Now, you'll have to pardon me if I'm a little skeptical here. Of course, Governor Asa Hutchinson and others were there to make the announcement. Listen to this. About 200 employees wearing company dress of tan pants and black shirts joined Paul Rivera, the plant's operations manager, Governor Hutchinson, and others for the announcement. To make room for the crowd, workers cleared an area of about 20 feet by 100 feet of assembly line machinery used to produce medium wheel loaders that weigh from 21 tons to 39 tons and handle payloads of up to 12 tons. Quote, "You made this happen," Hutchinson told the crowd of workers. He said Arkansas is sixth in the nation in the percentage of its workforce engaged in manufacturing, with the creation of more than 5,000 manufacturing jobs since he took office. Quote, "Caterpillar's expansion today illustrates what we're good at, how we want to grow and build our state in this arena. Manufacturing is coming back to the United States of America." Okay, now, he's certainly trying to piggyback on Trump's, at least it's an American company, right? Instead of a communist Chinese company we're going to give money to, our money to, existing Arkansas taxpayer business owners' money to, so that they come and use our resources and then sell the products back to us. At least it's not that. So I'll give him I'll give him that, right? But if you scroll down here, the reason I'm skeptical, okay, is listen to this. In 2010, Caterpillar opened the $140 million plant with 600 employees, averaging a salary of $44,000 a year. In 2009, in announcing its plans for the North Little Rock plant, Caterpillar qualified for a rebate on payroll taxes and for credits on sales and use taxes. It also received $3 million from the governor's Quick Action Closing Fund and $325,000 for training. Okay? The original $3 million agreement required Caterpillar to create and maintain 500 positions, according to the Arkansas Economic Development Commission. They did not meet the employment requirements for 2012, 2013, and 2014, and therefore had to pay back $172,000. Now, that's weird. $3 million, they had to pay back $172,000. I guess I would take that deal all day long. With 410 full-time employees at the end of last year, Caterpillar also didn't meet the employment threshold for 2017 and has since paid the state $54,000. Again, millions of dollars of incentives, and they pay back, what, $200,000, $300,000? That's weird. Listen to this. The article goes on. Full-time employment thresholds also were not met in 2015 and 2016. Yet we're going to continue this strategy, which at this point, we have other studies that back this up. This is a failed strategy. Instead of doing this, and I say this to the task force, and I call you by your correct name because I really think this is a good idea, why not eliminate the corporate tax in Arkansas altogether and treat all corporations, small and large, the same instead of giving all this money to Caterpillar so that they don't meet their promises. Now, the headlines look good for you now, right? So you get you'll have to sacrifice your political capital because you won't have any cool little press conferences that make you feel good that government creates jobs. Those will have to go. Listen to this. So they didn't meet the original agreement, and yet the Arkansas Economic Development Commission added an amendment to the state's deal with Caterpillar, and it voids returning any money to the state for underperformance for years 2015 and 2016. So they just made a deal with Caterpillar that they're not going to have to pay back any more of the money they owe us. Is this a failed economic development strategy or what? Unbelievable. We got something for it, though. They agreed to extend the job monitoring period from 2018 to 2020. Sometime in the next 100 years, 250 more jobs are coming to Little Rock. So get ready for that. We got to take a break. Back in a minute.
Welcome to the Arkansas Obamacare Hotline. We would be more than happy to help you enroll in Arkansas Obamacare today. We just need a little information about you. Let's get started. If you're disabled, pregnant, or looking for medical care for your child, the program is currently full, and there's no doctors to see you. Please hang up now. If you're an able-bodied adult, please press 1. If you're currently employed, we're sorry, but you most likely do not qualify for the program. Please quit your job and call back later. If you don't work and instead play video games all day with your cats in your grandmother's basement, please press 1. If you've never lived in Arkansas, press 1. If you currently live in another state, press 1. If you recently purchased a home in New Jersey for $750,000, please press 1. If your current identity has previously been used by another person, was created before your actual date of birth, or doesn't really exist, please press 1. Congratulations! It sounds like you're the perfect candidate to receive Arkansas Obamacare. Please stay on the line, and a hardworking DHS employee will be with you as soon as possible. While you're waiting, feel free to relax as your ambitions to gainful employment fade away. PHP Parody. Exposing the truth and everything the Marble Palace establishment keep trying to cover up. It's Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell.
I want you to imagine that Senator John Woods, convicted Senator John Woods, didn't get sloppy with laundering the money to enrich himself. I want you to imagine that there was no mess-ups, no slip-ups, nobody that got word that Senator John Woods was stealing massive sums from taxpayers and to fund his lifestyle. Without term limits, he would have gotten reelected. Matter of fact, if he hadn't have decided not to run for reelection, Senator John Woods, if he hadn't decided to not run for reelection because he was being investigated by the feds, he likely would have won reelection. Governor Asa Hutchinson threw him a fundraiser right before he bowed out of the race. This was, I mean, this is where we would be. Imagine if these guys, imagine if Jake Files, right, had gotten away with it, and John Woods had gotten away with it, and Mike and Neal had gotten away with it. At some point, term limits are a check on the stuff that we don't know about, right? The stuff that we will never know about, because, trust me, there are people who are far more intelligent than Senator John Woods at working the Marble Palace government as they attend court down there for years, for, 20 years. They're far more efficient than some of these folks who got caught. There is a contingent at the Marble Palace, when you mention John Woods' name, they scoff and they say, amateurs. Back in just a moment.
It's Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell.
Hey, folks, I wanted to talk about something that was on my mind. I want to talk about the concept that being comfortable is the death of the constitutional republic. Now, you might be asking how. Well, there's an author that I really love, a theologian that I love. He's since passed on. His name's Francis Schaeffer, and he said that really it's all about the selfish desire of personal peace and affluence, that this is a problem that we have, personal peace and affluence. So when people get comfortable with how things are around them, they pay attention less, they vote less, they're less likely to fight back until things get uncomfortable. What happens in between comfort and discomfort? Well, you have the government. When people don't pay attention to what the government is doing, it will get out of control, and it will grow far beyond the reach of where it was intended to be. And we see that. We're not where we were intended to be, where we were at our founding. I mean, case in point, you have the ruling on the cake, and the baker doesn't have to bake the cake. I mean, is it not obvious that our founding fathers would have agreed with the concept of religious freedom, so you're not forced to participate in religious ceremonies you disagree with? So what about the evidence of this? Well, take about the evidence of people who are comfortable, okay? Donald Trump. Trump is the wake-up call we as a country have been waiting for, the silent majority, if you will. So where have all these people been since Reagan? Well, I mean, Reagan was a conservative president, right? A lot of people said best president in the 20th century, in modern times. Well, the silent majority, we got comfortable. People got comfortable after Reagan. They got okay with how things were until the discomfort of the size and scope of government and the corrupt politicians became so overbearing for them to handle that they had to make a change, because it was obvious that the prospect to the people of this country, the prospect of a Hillary Clinton presidency, was widely believed it was going to make people's lives worse. How does this affect us here? How does this affect us here in the state of Arkansas? Well, we're way too comfortable as a state with the current affairs, the current status quo here in Arkansas. We're way too comfortable with. During the primaries this year, voter turnout was unnervingly low. Outside groups like Conduit News or Patriots of X746, outside of groups like that, you don't really see a whole lot of pushback against the way things are going, the way the government's going here in Arkansas. So how did it become like this? Well, the fault rests squarely on the shoulders of the people. And if that sounds harsh, it's because it's supposed to. Arkansas and the Arkansas and the country as a whole are in the state they are in because we allowed this to happen.
The intersection of conservative ideas and reality. Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell.
Tonight, according to reports, we will at least know who Donald Trump's new Supreme Court justice nominee is going to be. Yes, I know. I'm excited about it. Talking Points memo writing that Trump is close to Supreme Court decision. So that's interesting. Down to 4 candidates. And either way, it doesn't matter who he picks. The media and the Democrats are going to go bananas. Just so you know, this is the way the process works. Barack Obama got to appoint 2 Supreme Court justices, Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor. And the Democrats said, oh, yep, this is just product of the election. This is just part of it, part of the election. Elections have consequences. And the same thing applies. You know, people want to say, what about Merrick Garland? Merrick Garland was appointed by or was nominated by Barack Obama during an election year where the Republicans had control of the Senate. Elections have consequences. And so they delayed the vote. Republicans still have control of the Senate, and we've got the White House too. So, I mean, this is not rocket science. For a lot of these participation trophy leftists, they can't handle losing and lose. I mean, you know, listen. When Donald Trump said, "Are you you're going to get tired of winning. We're going to win so much you're going to get tired of winning. I have to admit, I did not believe him, not to this extent. Not to this extent. Folks, Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin has an excellent op-ed over at talkbusiness.net. And he blows up a big part of the Republican establishment argument for raising your taxes on the internet. This is a big deal, this article that he wrote. Again, over at talkbusiness.net. He writes, the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in South Dakota versus Wayfair allows states to require out-of-state internet retailers to collect and remit sales tax when they do business with in-state customers. Given the ruling, Arkansas lawmakers will likely revisit the issue of taxing out-of-state internet sales as they have done the past several legislative sessions. We must consider what is fair for all taxpayers, including both brick-and-mortar retailers and consumers. The most compelling reason for requiring out-of-state retailers to collect and remit sales tax is the basic principle of fairness, to level the playing field between in-state brick-and-mortar stores like Bedford Camera and Video and large out-of-state internet retailers like Wayfair. Now, let me stop right there. I would slightly disagree with this idea of fairness because, folks, internet stores or internet retailers, they don't use the same resources that a brick and mortar does. They don't. It's different. It's very strange to make the argument, in my opinion, that a brick and mortar store that requires a paved road, it requires sewage, it requires, trash pickup, police protection, fire protection. That's what those sales taxes are going to pay for. If you are an internet company, your store is essentially a bunch of ones and zeros on a computer screen somewhere. I mean, it's digital. It doesn't use the same resources, okay? I mean, if anything, you make an argument that they use the roads to ship, but we pay a federal excise tax on tires for that. They are covered. It's not an issue of fairness. Now, you want to level the playing field. No one is going to shop less online because there's a sales tax. If you're a brick and mortar business and you're going out of business or because of the internet, you need to get on the internet because people are wanting to buy products that they don't necessarily care whether or not they can touch and feel, right? And so those kinds of businesses, if you're in the business where, you're selling something that somebody doesn't necessarily need to touch and feel before they buy, you need to start putting your stuff on the internet. And you need to change and get away from that brick and mortar model. That's it's just a slight disagreement, but Tim Griffin does go on to make a really good point. And again, he blows up an argument of the Republican establishment here in the state of Arkansas, if you keep reading here. He goes on, retailers like Walmart sell online but collect sales taxes because they have a physical presence in Arkansas. The 1992 Supreme Court decision in Quill versus North Dakota established the physical nexus test overturned by the court in Wayfair. Treating in-state and out-of-state retailers the same will not diminish the convenience of online shopping. Okay, there we go. But it will provide for fair tax treatment. But in the process of leveling the playing field, we should seize the opportunity to provide tax relief by returning any increase in state sales tax revenue to the taxpayers. Now, that is such welcome news to hear. And by the way, do you remember they were making that promise back in 2017? They said, we'll cut your taxes by as much as we've raised them. We promise. Let us grow government now. We'll shrink it later. We promise. You don't really hear that now. I haven't heard that from anybody as of late. I mean, Tim Griffin, but I haven't heard that from any other legislators now that the Wayfair decisions come down and now that we have a tax task force who is, trying to get the shell game right, get the ratios right. You know what I'm saying? I haven't heard that whatever new money comes in from an internet sales tax, they're going to reduce. But in the process of leveling the playing field, Tim Griffin writes, we should seize this opportunity to provide tax relief by returning any increase in state sales tax revenue to the taxpayers. Fairness cannot be a one-way street. It's a good point. The lieutenant governor goes on. Some argue that a tax on out-of-state internet sales is not a tax increase, since individuals and businesses are already supposed to pay an Arkansas use tax each year on any taxable purchases on which the sales tax was not collected by the seller. Tim Griffin writes, this is technically true. It is also true that very few individuals comply with this law, since most are unaware it exists, and it is too cumbersome for most Arkansans to keep track of every purchase throughout the year to remit a small amount of use tax. Since compliance is rare, requiring out-of-state retailers to collect and remit taxes will have the functional effect of increasing the tax burden on Arkansans who purchase goods over the internet. Technicalities aside, he writes, at the end of the day, more money will go to the government and less will be left in the pockets of taxpayers. This is the part where he has essentially blown up an establishment talking point about how it's not a tax increase. I mean, the point that Conduit News has been advocating for, I guess, over a year now is that if it takes more money out of our pockets and gives more money to the government, that is the definition of a tax increase. And if you're passing legislation to do that, to take more money from us, what he calls the functional effect, it's a tax increase. He goes on, the increase in state tax receipts is projected to total in the tens of millions of dollars, if not more, per year, and will be a windfall for the state treasury. But an expected increase in tax receipts should not lead to more spending. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin, for making that point. Our spending should be driven by our needs rather than how much money we have. He goes on, and he says, for example, thanks to Governor Hutchinson's leadership through the Transformation Advisory Board, which he is on, by the way, Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin is on, we are identifying areas where government can do more for less, spend less, and give better service to the taxpayer. Well, let me just say, we've got to quit increasing spending every single year. That should be the goal. Maybe a taxpayer bill of rights would be good. A taxpayer bill of rights that sets limits on how much the government can grow and how it has to turn back excess money back to the people. Something like that might be good. He goes on, we should remain steadfastly focused on reforming state government, not spending more hard-earned taxpayer dollars, and those who believe we need to spend more should make the case to the voters anew and not through the back door of a surprise court decision. Ouch. Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin expressing a little bit of skepticism from those in power and how they can use, anything as an excuse to spend more money. We should remain steadfastly focused on reforming state government and not spending more hard-earned taxpayer dollars. And those who believe we need to spend more should make the case to the voters anew and not through the back door of a surprise court decision. Let's level the playing field for Arkansas brick-and-mortar businesses without growing a state government that taxes too much and spends too much. Wow, so the current state of Arkansas government, according to Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin, compliments to Asa Hutchinson aside, taxes too much and spends too much. Just so we're clear. In 2015, the legislature passed Act 709 requiring the state to do exactly what I just described. But the one notable exception, only tax receipts exceeding $70 million will be returned to taxpayers through tax relief. Unless the law is amended, it is possible that Arkansas taxpayers won't see any tax relief. The state should return every dollar generated from taxing out-of-state internet sales to the taxpayers by reducing tax rates. He goes on, when I was a member of Congress, I was co-sponsor of Chairman Steve Womack's Marketplace Equity Act. I've always believed in leveling the playing field for Arkansas's local businesses that are so important to our economy. I've also always believed that the increase in tax receipts from taxing out-of-state internet sales should result in reduced taxes, not increased spending. Again, I heard this idea many times in 2017 from politicians when they were pushing Jake Files' internet sales tax bill. I'm just not hearing that now. Maybe we will. Maybe it's being said right now, and I don't know, other than Tim Griffin here. On July 24th, 2012, as a member of the U.S. House Judiciary Committee, I attended a hearing on Chairman Womack's Marketplace Equity Act, where two of my Democratic colleagues from California argued that Congress must address taxation of internet sales because California was missing out on $1.8 billion per year in tax revenue. They thought the purpose of the legislation was to line the pockets of state governments in order to increase spending. We should resist the urge to spend more money and focus on spending money more wisely. We must also be careful regarding our treatment of small businesses and not make it harder for today's fledgling startups to become tomorrow's successful companies. The compliance burden should be borne by government, not the private sector. Common sense should be our guide. We don't need aggressive tax collectors sending threatening letters to everyone selling homemade crafts on eBay or Etsy. Ultimately, fairness means doing right by both sides. Leveling the playing field for brick-and-mortar businesses is a noble and worthwhile goal, but it shouldn't come at the expense of hardworking taxpayers. If we take the appropriate action, it won't have to. Again, that's Tim Griffin over at talkbusiness.net, the lieutenant governor of the state of Arkansas. What do you guys think about this? Again, I don't buy the fairness argument to it because I think the internet outthought the government, thank goodness, and it's a technical achievement, and I don't think an internet business in many cases is the same thing as a brick and mortar. The taxes are supposed to go to help police and fire and roads and all this other stuff, and an internet business doesn't have any of that, and so why should they have to pay? That's my personal opinion. I don't buy the whole fairness thing. I can set up an internet business in 24 hours and have it up and running. You could not do that with a brick and mortar business. Okay, there's a huge difference there. But I do agree with the lieutenant governor on essentially saying, yes, more money from the people to the government is a tax increase. It's an increase in the tax burden. I completely agree with him there. And I also agree with him saying that we're spending too much money. We're taxing our people too much, and we're spending too much money here in the state of Arkansas. And mark my words, anytime Tim Griffin, I've noticed this, that anytime Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin comes out and says that we're spending too much money, he gets attacked by the left. And anytime that happens, I'm always like, oh, okay, good. Well, it's the left is alive and well. They actually will attack a Republican in leadership. We got to take a break. This is Conduit News Radio. Back in just a moment.
Buy, sell, and trade at Triple R Pawn in Ash Flat. Firearms, computers, sporting goods, musical instruments, tools, jewelry, and everything else you can think of. It's all at Triple R Pawn at the Light in Ash Flat. Gun enthusiasts, log on now to triplrpawn.com and browse their amazing inventory. That's triplrpawn.com. You can also call them at 870-994-PAWN. That's 870-994-7296. Let the great team at Triple R Pawn help you find what you're looking for. That's Triple R Pawn at the Light in Ash Flat, triplrpawn.com, or call 870-994-PAWN.
Russellville-based firearms manufacturer Omega are making clones of the most notable German firearms in the world. These delayed rotor-lock firearms have been and are currently used by law enforcement and military worldwide. At Omega, they manufacture their guns right here in Arkansas and produce the best reproduction in the marketplace that comes with a complete 5-year warranty. At Omega, they take firearm manufacturing seriously and offer discounts to active and retired law enforcement. Whether you're using Omega firearms to defend the public, defend your family, or for target practice, Omega has your back. For pricing, go to omega-guns.com. That's omega-guns.com. If you're like me, You believe that small business is the heart of Arkansas's economic engine, and it should be viewed that way by the politicians in Little Rock. Conduit for Commerce also believes, like you and I believe, policies that achieve less regulation and lower taxation help small business in Arkansas thrive. Other policies like small, constitutionally consistent government and reducing citizen dependency on government keeps it from growing and expanding its influence on our daily lives. Conduit for Commerce works every day to educate the general public and legislators on these important priorities in the name of Arkansas small business. By the way, contributions to Conduit for Commerce are tax deductible. Log on now to conduitforcommerce.org and click on Contact Us on the right side of the page. That's conduitforcommerce.org. Go there now and learn the facts on protecting small business in Arkansas. Bob Maloney here from ASA News, The Parrot. Breaking news from the Capitol in Little Rock. Over now to our new on-site reporter, Susan Shenanigans. Susan?
Thanks, Bob. The governor has just announced that a Blue Ribbon Task Force is to be formed.
Today, I'm asking your support for a Blue Ribbon Legislative Task Force to be created and directed to recommend further reform.
Now we go live to the chamber to listen in for more information on the task force.
I hereby call this session into order. First on the agenda for today is the formation of the Blue Ribbon Task Force. Is there anyone who would like to give their thoughts on the task force?
Yes, as someone who is deeply conservative, why is the governor choosing the color blue for this task force? Sounds like he's really a Democrat loyalist. Why not a red ribbon to prove he's a true conservative?
Well, I represent Walmart, and we agree with the color of the task force ribbon. The color blue is best consistent with the Walmart brand.
I object to this choice. Blue is the wrong color ribbon for this task force.
Well, who are you?
I am Mr. P.C. Wrights, and I represent Target, and we want the ribbon to be red, not blue.
Hold it right there. This seems like a tough decision. Why not ask the governor to call a special session at a later date for an important decision as this?
I think this is something worth talking about. I motion that we decide the color of the ribbon today.
I second it. Fine. We can decide it now. Does anyone have any other suggestions for the color of the ribbon?
I think the color should be white.
Whoa. Hold on. Definitely not white.
I agree with Mr. P.C. Wrights. Maybe we should choose green for the farmers.
You like the color green because you are a farmer. I think it should be purple, so we can display how Arkansas is an extremely moderate state.
Why are we even discussing this? Shouldn't we be talking about tax reform instead of wasting time with this?
Well, the people have spoken. They believe this is worth talking about, so we are deciding this now.
Excuse me, sir, but shouldn't the color of the ribbon be rainbow to include all types of people?
Please, silence your phones.
I just received a call from Walmart HQ, and they agree with, what was your name again? My name is Fabulous. They agree with Fabulous that the color should be rainbow.
Target concurs with the decision of it being rainbow-colored ribbon.
Is there a motion to make the ribbon rainbow-colored?
I motion to make the color rainbow.
I second the motion. The motion carries because I said so.
The committee will now vote and not be on record to keep the people in the dark. Back to you, Bob.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you for listening to ASA News, The Parrot. Next up, there are reports of a gorilla on top of the Capitol Dome demanding massive sums of taxpayer cash. His name? Medicaid expansion.
WHP Parody. Need your daily news fix? Don't forget to tune in to Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell.
I don't mean to get any of you guys out there too outraged this morning. I know we're only 5 minutes till 8. We're at the end of the broadcast. We had a really comprehensive news day today. A lot to get to. But this just flashed across my screen. It's a Breitbart article about former President Jimmy Carter. And he was asked about gay marriage. He said, personally, it's no problem with me. I think everybody should have a right to get married regardless of their sex. Okay, all right. That's a very live and let live mentality. In the context of, the freedom to do it, yeah, sure. I mean, your freedom ends where mine begins, right? But he took it a step further because he was asked about how gay marriage coincides with his claimed Christian faith. And that's where Jimmy Carter said this, quote, I don't have any verse in Scripture. Now, that's the optimal part on this, meaning he has no verse in Scripture to reference what he's just about to conclude. The character of God he is about to portray as fact, which is really just his own opinion. He has no verse in Scripture to back up. It is important that you understand that before I read you what he said next. Quote, I don't have any verse in Scripture. I believe that Jesus would approve of gay marriage. I think Jesus would encourage any love affair if it was honest and sincere and was not damaging to anyone else, and I don't see that gay marriage damages anyone else. End quote. Again, it is important to emphasize that he has no verse in Scripture to back this up. There are, however, many other verses in the Bible that would contradict, what he's saying, Scripture. I find it quite odd. This is not, we shouldn't be surprised, I guess. You see, it seems like the Word of God will always offend, or has the capacity to offend whatever the dominant culture is of the day, in whatever part of the world, and it does it in different ways. I've heard it explained like this before. If you take the passages, in the Bible that have to do with, let's say, gay marriage, or have to do with marriage, or waiting until you're married to consummate those types of things. Here in America, that's offensive to us, right? In the secular world, that's regressive. That's regressive. That's not freedom. We want to be progressive and everything else. But if you read the passage in the Bible that says, love thy neighbor as yourself. Oh, well, of course, love thy neighbor as thyself. We accept that message that's in the Bible, but we reject this other one because it offends our culture. But if you take that same message over to the Middle East and you say, well, here's the purity policy, sexual purity policy, or what it's advocating, in the Middle East, they say, oh, that's not restrictive enough. We need to do things like, the things they do with females and things like that to try to prevent them from being promiscuous, right? But if you take the love thy neighbor as thyself into the Islamo-fascist territory, they will say, well, that's a sign of weakness. Love thy neighbor as thyself. What if he's your enemy? Turn the other cheek. That's a sign of weakness. And see, that offends their culture. I find it interesting how the Word of God can offend based on where it's being read and the culture that it's in. But it doesn't mean, just because it offends you and your sensibilities, it doesn't mean it's not true. That doesn't mean that, that there are not consequences as well. Folks, that's all the time we have for today. Arkansas, be safe.